Welcome on behalf of Kaisa and myself to our conversation for Thinkers 50 for International Women's Day. And I guess we should introduce ourselves first. Kaisa, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Maja. So my name is Kaisa Snellman. I'm an associate professor of organizational behavior at INSEAD. I do work on labor market discrimination and inequality in a broader sense. So not just focusing on gender, but I also do work on social inequality when it comes to race or class or educational background. So that's me. Maja, what about you?
This is awkward, isn't it, when we're doing it this formally? But my name is Dr. Maja Korica, and I'm an associate professor as well at Warwick Business School in the UK. And I think similarly to you, I don't, gender aspects are not the only thing that I research. In fact, I normally describe myself with a slightly awkward moniker of a microsociologist of business elites, which in effect means that I look at how people with power in organizations or boards or CEOs, how they do their jobs and the consequences, I guess, of that, which is part of the reason why I'm also interested more broadly in good work, good careers, good cultures. So the kind of down consequences of good and bad leadership. And as part of that, I have a particular interest in inequalities, various inequalities, of which I guess the position and dynamics around women is just one. So I'm happy that we are talking about that today. And I guess when we were setting this up, we thought we would kind of have a few questions and make them a little bit polemical. So I'll start with the first polemical question, but of course evidence-based as well, because we're academics. And I guess my question to start us is, if you could get rid of one myth out there concerning women in business, particularly given that we have evidence to the contrary, what would that myth be, or myths?
So I love this question, but at the same time, it's like such a hard question. And
where do you start?
There aren't enough myths there. It's the opposite. There's so many myths that I think that we should abolish once and for all. And sort of to segue into this conversation, like a lot of my research is actually based on taking these myths that are out there, either as myths as claims about women and men being fundamentally different, or more broadly, like policy solutions that have been proposed as fixes that might actually not be fixes to a problem, or they could be fixes to one problem and then at the same time create another problem. So I think quite often we're very hasty in proposing a solution without actually looking at the evidence, whether that proposed solution is a good fix or not. But going back to these like myths about gender. So if I have to really, really pick my favorite myth to get rid of, my absolute pet peeve would be this persistent myth about diversity, that there is a business case for diversity. So we
didn't plan this, by the way. I should say none of the answers have been rehearsed.
Exactly. You pick any newspaper, Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and or you go to the website of nonprofits like the World Economic Forum, or you pick up some banks like Credit Suisse, or you look at consulting agencies. You will see this consistent narrative about how we should increase diversity because it makes businesses perform better. And this is despite the fact that there's absolutely no empirical evidence to support this. So when companies increase diversity, they don't usually increase their profits. They usually do not increase their sales. They are not maximizing value for shareholders. Or even like when we look at group level, there's very little evidence sort of in the business context that more diverse groups are any better at decision making at the corporate level. But for sure, like, this can apply to sort of, small groups. But in this context, there's no actual evidence. And why is this my favorite pet peeve? Is because I think promoting this business case for diversity is actually hurting the cause. So instead of just embracing diversity for diversity's sake, when we frame diversity that, there will be some natural benefit of it, well, first of all, it's incorrect, but also it's sort of like sets up the expectations wrong. So let's say like we promote more women to corporate boards. Well, now if we don't actually see any, financial performance outcomes, then the question is like, well, did we choose the wrong women? When so it's not helpful in the long run to sort of frame it in this way. So I'm not anti-diversity, as some people have claimed. I'm very pro-diversity, but for the right reasons.
Yeah.
What about you?
Go. Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think it's such an interesting question, because when I teach this subject, and I literally just recorded a lecture for my full-time MBAs, I also try to talk about it more from the perspective of what might having diverse voices or greater inclusion mean in terms of different kind of, overconfidence, for instance, being a huge issue. The issues that I see at the top of organizations of kind of inner circle, groupthink type of dynamics. So really more about work rather than, as you say, about kind of externally facing, I guess, concerns. And I think there's also something interesting, and this isn't my idea. This is somebody I read years ago in the FT, but I think there's something about, this idea that somehow women have to prove the business case to be included. Totally removes the responsibility from proving the case for the people of the status quo. You're like, why don't we use the financial crisis or any of the other failures as whole-scale evidence that the status quo is wrong? Instead, the kind of onus is placed on women and other minorities to make a case for their own inclusion. So I think there's maybe a wrong direction there. I don't know your thoughts about that. It's your research.
Completely there. Like for me, it's the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. We do not need a reason. We don't need a case. Why should we be disqualifying competent, qualified people, getting where they have earned with their, own skills and their qualifications? Like, we don't need to like, oh, include me, I will make you better. No, I'm just as good as everybody else. Yeah. And people should have a fair shake. It's about the playing field, because it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely, 100%. I'm really happy. And like I said, we didn't plan this, so we don't know our answers. What am I? I think I'm in a similar situation to you. I was actually thinking about this and thinking, okay, what would be mine? And I think and I'll try to be very quick about them, but I have like 3 that I absolutely detest, in the sense that I think they're constantly, I get constantly asked these things and I don't think they're right. I think firstly, this idea that women don't negotiate. So it's often kind of put on as a kind of almost kind of blame response. So women don't ask, so therefore what do they expect? And I think, we know the research of Iris Bonet and others at Harvard that show that women do ask, but only, for instance, the ads make it explicit that there's a range to actually negotiate. And then, that it's negotiation is even a possibility. And even then, managers tend to kind of give them lower counter offers. And I think this has to do with kind of persistent myths about kind of women being seen as greedy or self-promoting, and how detrimental that is to us in particular. So that's why I don't like it. I think similarly, this idea that you don't have to self-promote, that your work will promote you. I think I particularly like the work of Robert Jackal, who was working in the 80s. His book Moral Mazes is great. Then he actually didn't study gender. He studied promotion in large organizations. And his basically evidence shows that after a certain level, say middle management, it's the social that gets you promoted. So familiarity, basically loyalty. And so all of those factors that are in particular, for instance, gained through presenteeism, hanging out with your bosses, things that inevitably exclude certain kinds of people. And so this idea of kind of persistent myth or meritocracy, in particular, that, you should kind of, as Satya Nadella said, trust the system a few years ago. He corrected himself, but he said you should trust the system and not ask. I think that's a really, really dangerous one, and I particularly don't like that one. And I think finally, and perhaps this is my kind of pet peeve in particular, I think this idea that somehow our individual successes as women in business or in kind of workplaces, that our individual successes prove somehow that the entire system works. I think it's a really dangerous one, because in my experience, the actual experience is, it works for a very, very privileged few. So at the top, there's only, 4, 5, 10, 8 places, however many in boards or CEO roles. And somehow there's this kind of persistent myth that those women kind of pushing, I'm now talking about women, or other minorities pushing through to those proves that somehow the system works for everybody. And I think that's patently untrue. In fact, they're sort of the exception to the fact. So I really dislike that kind of notion that somehow individual success equals broader success.
Exactly. And I really like your the point that you made about this sort of the flavor of victim blaming, which is so often the case when we give helpful advice to women. So rather than fixing the system or identifying, glitches in the system, we give this sort of like lean in type of advice and say, it's sort of your fault because you don't negotiate. And also, to go back to your negotiation myth, is like, it's sort of like perpetuating this stereotype, because if you do negotiate, then you're actually being a bad woman. So offering that as a reason has sort of like a double, blade, harm, because it suggests that the reason why there is a pay gap is because women aren't asking enough, and those who do, they should feel bad for sort of not.
It's a double bind, isn't it? Everything is a double bind. That's this classic thing.
Yeah. So talking about those, that's sort of like an advice that's being put out there. Like, what about you? Like, if we get a little bit personal at this stage of our chat, like, what is the worst piece of professional advice that you have ever been given?
I mean, I think you'll love this one in the sense that it might further add to your sort of rage-driven motivation to then do research. But we've talked a little bit about this before. But I should say it's not necessarily technically advice. It's more sort of, I guess, unsolicited, judgmental statement. But I guess that functioned as advice. And I should also clarify that the person who said it is somebody who I've known for a long time. And I think the intention genuinely was from maybe a slightly paternalistic, but from a place of wanting to be helpful. But then clearly I was still taken aback. So I'll cut to the chase. We were in a meeting. We were doing basically planning of the work that we wanted to do and when we wanted to do it. And the person in question sort of turned around and in the middle of a sentence sort of interrupted and said, well, that's your problem, isn't it? You are too much of a perfectionist, and that's also why you're single. Now, I know, and in that moment, I sort of thought, well, what? And also, professional meeting wasn't really where I expected to get a sort of dig at my personal life and how that was going. But I think it took me a few weeks to then, and actually a few years since then, to kind of figure out why it bugged me and why I think it's such bad advice or intervention. I think firstly because I think implicit in that is this idea that somehow we shouldn't expect perfect. We shouldn't expect what we want and need. So our own standards are not the ones to which we should kind of have ownership over. It is other people's standards and other people's perceptions of our needs that should somehow drive us. So, and I think that's been so corrosive in so many ways to women's rights in history, but also to women's progression. So, no. And I think, but paradoxically, why I think it's also very interesting is because for me, one of the best things that I've ever done professionally is waited for a perfect version of a partnership in my own personal life. So not settling for something that was going to be less. And so, for instance, in my husband, and I have to say, I didn't plan for this. I got lucky for this. But, my husband is not just the kind of card-carrying feminist who's like, yay for your, aspirations as much as mine, but is also somebody who are absolutely 50-50 with childcare, with household chores, with, the emotional labor, the kind of mental load of taking care of things, and also of generally kind of career interest. And I think we know the fact that at home circumstances, support from your family, from your partners are so critical to women's advancement. And so I think in the end, the reason why it was bad advice is I think actually both professionally and personally, I think perfection is, or some version of your own perfection is actually what you should be aiming for, or at least that's me.
It sort of echoes my experience in terms of bad advice. And my story is well, let me sort of tell you about the advice and then the backstory to it. So my pet peeve in terms of professional advice is when women are pushed to be like more like men, perhaps, but at the same time, not really like men, but men without rights. And let me sort of explain. So I once had the pleasure of working in an organization that was not only male dominated, but traditionally very hard for women to get promoted in. And during my first week of getting to know the place, I was given a lot of helpful advice, well-meaning advice, obviously. And one of the women pulled me aside and said, it's not advisable to include pictures of your kids. Like, she's like, do you have a kid? And I said, yes, he's 4. And she's like, well, that's great, but just don't make him seen. So no, kids' artwork, no pictures. And it's actually better if you just don't mention that you're a mother. And I was like naive enough to actually take this advice into heart. And then walking around the building, I started noticing like how all my male colleagues like had plastered their walls with their kids, artwork from, kindergarten, and, all the happy family pictures were there. And I started to really wonder, like, where is this, double standard coming from? But not only that, but like, what are the consequences? Like, I felt like, I had to sort of live a double life, essentially. Like, I could not be a mother. I would have to lie if my child was sick, like I'm sick, because the punishment of staying home with a sick kid were much more severe for mothers than they were for dad. So, having, being a good dad was an asset, whereas being a mother, you're not really committed to your work. So, and this sort of like echoes the bad advice I sometimes like see junior faculty giving to grad students, well-meaningly, but like when people say like, oh, if you really want to make it in academia, you should not travel, you should not take vacations, like you should not even go to the movies. And that's not only is it untrue, like I have always, I know people who've gone to see a movie in they go into grad school, but also it's unhealthy to sort of picture that type of a lifestyle and then promote that to the generations. And then we say like, where are all these like anxiety issues coming from in academia? Well, it's because we're making it unhealthy. So that's sort of like toxic overachievement, which sort of relates to the perfectionism that you're talking about. Like, no wonder that not only is it like gender skewed, but it's actually making it harder for everybody in academia.
Absolutely. And I think, and just going back, it reminds me, I've kind of talked about this, but it's such a sort of motherhood penalty, fatherhood bonus situation that you were describing. And then, of course, other things, other ways in which we promote ourselves, like, for instance, being around, having those social connections, being able to freely talk and make connections. Well, if you have to hide a huge part of your life, how are you going to do that, right? So it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Yeah. How about a bit, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
How about a bit of positive then advice? What's the best advice you ever received?
All right, so sort of in short, like the best advice that I've ever been given is it sort of, just professionally, it's about like really like following your instinct and doing the type of work that you love. So this was during my first year as an assistant professor. I was sitting in my office late in the evening, lamenting to my dear colleague John Piero Petriglieri about like the anxieties about being an untenured professor, like that lies ahead. And I was trying to ask him about advice, like what should I strategically be doing? So my situation was that I was coming from a policy school into a business school, having a background in sociology, and it was kind of hard to carve myself a niche, like find my identity in a group of management scholars. And he looked at me and was like, you should not try to second guess yourself or try to guess what other people want to see in you. The only person who knows what you want to do is you. And he said that type of like sort of strategic planning, oh, I should do work in this area because that will get tenure, will make your life miserable. Now, you might get tenure, you might not get tenure, but you should enjoy the journey.
Enjoy the journey.
And every day, on that journey, like doing work that you don't actually like or that you don't find meaningful, just because you think that it will get you to a certain goal, it probably doesn't get you to that goal, but you also waste 5 years of your life doing something that is not meaningful. So I took his advice to heart, and every day since then, like I've been doing the type of work that I consider important and meaningful, and hopefully that's sort of reflected in the work too. And
I'm sure it is.
advice I give to my students, like, don't be strategic. Do the best work that you can do and enjoy it.
Yeah. And I think I kind of have a similar kind of part of my answer is about that, which is, I guess my two bits, and they're related, is learn to say no and stop trying to be liked by everybody. And I think the second one in particular relates in part to what you were saying. And I think what's also hard for us, particularly as given our jobs, is, I get student evaluations every month of my life. And sometimes they will be coming because of the kind of issues that I teach, including, for instance, diversity and inclusion, including, for instance, I teach my students to engage power in politics as a kind of positive, but also to support themselves as well in certain kinds of contexts and protect them. And I feel like sometimes there's a kind of judgment there about, you can become kind of swept up in this idea of external evaluation and that being your worth. And I think similarly to you, though for me, it's more about, if I speak truth to power, and if I use the provisions that I have to raise issues that are important, and if that rubs people the wrong way, maybe the problem is them and not me. And I shouldn't just want to satisfy everybody, because that will be absolutely impossible. And I think for that reason as well, the kind of learn to say no, I think it's such a privilege to have gotten to a point where it's less costly for me to say no to some things. But I think I've kind of, sometimes we can internalize this kind of rat race idea where you just kind of want to, and you need to be showing up. And I think actually learning to say no, and learning to say no with intention that is your own, I think that's been really valuable to me. And it's been people in my personal life who I've trusted, who've kind of helped me get to that point of realizing that. And it's very liberating. And I sleep much better.
So I have a version of your no, which is a no, comma, but. So, yeah. And then this I learned from my other Petriglieri colleague, Jennifer Petriglieri, who has this very wonderful way of saying no to things, but then suggesting other people.
Yes.
So you're being asked to do something that, could be good, but you just don't have the time. So instead of just saying no, you say, no, unfortunately, I cannot do it. But how about my colleague Kaisa? It's really like in her wheelhouse. And I've taken this from her, and I tried to do it the same for other junior colleagues or students of mine. And sometimes what is, a chore for me might actually be a good sort of exercise or, good experience. To, sort of forging their own path. So I say, no, but I know that somebody who would be great for this. Why don't you ask them? So that tends to sort of, it's also easier to say no when you have another name in your mind. And so that's also the advice that I would give to others in the sort of the no game. So we talked a little bit about sort of the pet peeves and the myths, and we felt like maybe, we could just take it sort of down to the more practical level and talk about corporate practices. So if there is one sort of challenge, a corporate practice that you would want to challenge or change or, completely revamp, what would that be?
I think, so it's something that you've mentioned earlier, and I'll be very brief here and very to the point. And I'll just pick one. I think it has to do with this idea of focusing on coaching and on mentoring women instead of focusing on sponsorship. It's such a pet peeve for me, because you mentioned it earlier, this kind of lean in notion that women somehow are in complete control of their destiny and they have to internalize their own work and their own subsequent failures. So if they do fail, it's down to them and they should just buckle up and do some more educating. I think that's so corrosive, because as I said, Robert Jackal and others, we have a plethora of evidence that shows that no amount of coaching is going to get you ahead in a system that does not want you to get ahead. And I think also we know that part of the way that, like I said, we get ahead in organizations is through social replication and something like sponsorship, where somebody picks up the phone and says, I know Kaisa for this. You please don't call on anybody else. Kaisa's your woman. I think that is how, in many ways, organizations are. So I think if it's mentorship and sponsorship, do that. And I think to that point, it cannot be informal. So too often, this kind of sponsorship and mentorship are left informally for people to arrange themselves, and it ends up basically a further means of social replication, and again, further inequality. So I would say, for God's sake, stop the coaching thing, stop the education thing, particularly at middle and senior levels. Start investing in sponsorship and in directed mentorship, and change your systems.
I fully agree with that. So enough with the the mentoring, in with the sponsoring. The question is, like, how do we actually formalize that? And I do not have an answer, but at least if we can change the focus from the mentoring to sponsoring, that's like the first step. For me, it's like kind of related, like not an actual practice, but one of the things that I think that we could easily change, and it's not a costly thing to do, is to change the narrative that we use when promoting or hiring women. So too often do I see that, when we, hire a woman or promote a woman, that it becomes a gender issue. And for me, this is so detrimental to women, because when everything becomes about, the first female dean or the first female board member, all we hear is female, female, female. And when we look at these people, these diehard professionals with years and years of experience, behind them, with all education, and everything just comes down to their gender, like the competence part is completely forgotten. So I think this is such an, easy sort of cheap change, if you will, because it's only words. That I think would be helpful in many contexts. But, again, easier said than done.
But I think it has to do, going back to this idea of balancing, on the one hand, the visibility aspect and the aspirational aspect, which might be important for some. But as you say, and I share your concerns, I think it also creates this idea that somehow they didn't get there on merit. They got there on other reasons, and the kind of notion of glass cliff in particular. Most recently, KPMG UK having a kind of scandal of a senior leader saying something quite silly, and then for the first time, 2 women are appointed temporarily into that role. That's also not a particular solution, because then the narrative is, for the first time in 150 years, 2 women have taken up, and actually you've just given them a poison chalice to boot, right? Not only are you questioning their competence, but also giving them an organization at the worst possible time. But yeah, that's
it should not be the punishment.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Enjoy it. Yeah. I guess we're down to our final question, and hopefully this is an interesting one. So, if you look back, or if you kind of met yourself from 10 years ago, what would you want to say to yourself from what you know now? What bit of advice?
So one thing I would say, never cut banks. They do not work for you. Like, kind of anxiety issues that you're going through life, banks are never the option. So call your sister and don't go to the hairdresser. But more seriously speaking, 10 years ago, I was an anxious, nerve-wrack, PhD student just about to graduate. I had no idea what future would bring with it. Like, I was about to start a postdoc at Harvard. I had no, permanent faculty position lined up, and all I did was, like, I spent every night waking up 3:15 in the morning worrying about the future. So if there's one thing I could tell myself, it'll be fine. It'll work out. Life is too short to be so anxious about everything that will come. So enjoy being a mother. I had a 4-year-old at the time, and instead of hopping on my bike and going over to Starbucks to work on my dissertation every morning, I wish I had taken those Saturday mornings to make pancakes and enjoy being a mom. So not to say don't do work, but find a better balance and just trust that the future will bring good things. You don't know what the future will bring, but being worried about it is not going to make the journey any easier. So that's a very personal sort of reassuring thing that I would tell myself, but probably applicable to other people in the same situation. What about you?
I think for it's kind of related. I think take care of yourself. I think the lesson that, I can give all of myself to work, but, work doesn't love you back. Nobody at work will prioritize you unless you prioritize yourself. So I think that's been a really hard lesson for me. And I think I have my mother to thank for that particular one. She's a very wise woman. I'm very lucky. I think, and I think the second one, and I think this is a really kind of important one for me, I think I would tell myself it is not a level playing field out there. So stop blaming yourself and internalizing, basically other people's successes around you to which you had absolutely no shot, even though perhaps you had deserved at least a foot in. That's not down to you or your lack of worth or your lack of effort. That's just the system. And so keep at it. And maybe one day you'll be in a place like this and you'll be able to maybe contribute to changing at least parts of that system, or at least the way that it normalizes some things. So, keep chipping away at it, I think, and protect yourself in the process. I think it's hard work.
I think that's very sound advice to anybody at any career stage. So take care of yourself and maybe take care of, the people around you too. So
yeah. Not just your successes. No, but this has been absolutely awesome. I think we've actually been on time as well, which is amazing.
Yeah, this was a blast. Thank you, Maja, for it was great to get together and chat about our pet peeves and some
other things.
And sharing
and like we said as well, to actually meet another person. It's been a year in which we've not met anybody new in forever, so this has been a genuine pleasure.
Great.
Thank you.
And happy Women's Day, everybody.
Happy Women's Day, everybody.